Hello and welcome everyone. I am pleased to open the first Speakers and Conversation series of this year's 21st edition of the Warwick Economics Summit. For over 20 years now, the Warwick Economics Summit has built a reputation as the leading platform for debating and discussing the most pressing global issues of today. WES is known for being the largest student-run economics conference in Europe. And today, we're extremely excited to welcome our guests to this virtual stage. I will now hand over to Bill Weir, who will moderate this discussion. Bill Weir is a CNN anchor, chief climate correspondent, and was the host and executive producer of the acclaimed CNN original series, The Wonderlist with Bill Weir. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone, from very early New York City. It's such a treat and a thrill to be with you. This Warwick Summit has a storied reputation and draws some very interesting minds, which is why I set the alarm this morning, because I couldn't wait to talk to both of these people who I've admired from afar, and it's so great to meet virtually. Our first guest, Professor Yuval Harari, historian, philosopher, best-selling author, of course, of *Sapiens* and A Brief History of Humankind, *Homo Deus*, the follow-up to that, A Brief History of Tomorrow, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. They've held positions number 1 to 3, I think, on the Sunday Times bestseller list for something like 96 consecutive weeks. His books have sold over 35 million copies in 65 languages. And I've been quoting *Sapiens* since the day it came out. He has a new endeavor called *Sapienship*, which manages his media as well as other sort of multimedia presentations, which sounds very exciting. So Professor Yuval Harari, welcome. Great to see you, sir.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And our other guest this morning, Vanessa Nakate, is a climate activist from Uganda and the founder of the African-based Rise Up movement. She began striking in Kampala in front of the parliament there in January of 2019 after witnessing droughts and flooding devastate communities in her home country, and seeing, of course, the work of Greta Thunberg. She now campaigns particularly internationally to highlight the impacts of climate change, how it's already playing out in Africa. She focuses particularly on how the climate crisis is exacerbating poverty and conflict and gender equality, as well as promoting a key climate solution and educating girls. She's been at high-level events around the globe, including the World Economic Forum 2020, named the BBC's one of 100 most influential women of the year, as well as one of the 100 most influential young Africans. Vanessa, great to meet you as well as a Twitter follower. Good morning.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning.
Before we get rolling, I'd actually like Professor Harari to sort of set us off on an optimistic note. When you live in this beat, it's easy to get really depressed most days.
Yes.
Since as you have taught us, Professor Harari, that we're all made of stories. They form our borders and our currencies and our flags and our corporations. And the story that we're living through now is as seismic as any in human history, I think. But you like to start off with an optimistic note when it comes to the cost of really meaningful solutions. So could you explain sort of your 2% solution?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you know, in recent years, too many people have switched very quickly from denial to despair, from dismissing climate change or not giving it enough importance to feeling that, oh, it's too late. The end of the world or the end of civilization is coming and it's too late to do something about it. And actually, when you read the reports, different reports of experts from various fields, and you ask, what is the price tag of stopping catastrophic climate change? It's surprisingly moderate. It's estimated by different panels and experts at about an additional 2% of global annual GDP, the gross domestic product of the entire world, of the whole of humanity. If we invest an additional 2% of that every year in the right places, we can prevent catastrophic climate change. Now, 2% of global GDP is still a lot of money, but the key message is that it is a feasible political project. Politicians are actually quite good at shifting 2% of resources from here to there. When there is a war to fight, they spend much more. You know, you don't need to completely dismantle the economic system. You don't need to completely overhaul the political system. We just need to get our priorities right. We don't have a lot of time to do it. We need to do it now, but we have the resources. There is no reason to succumb to despair.
Vanessa, what do you think when you hear those words? I'm interested in your origin story. What inspired you to go sit on a solo strike in Kampala there, but also what you've learned since you've been doing this, the highs and the lows, the interactions, and do you take hope from those numbers that the professor throws out?
Yes, I do agree with Professor Harari that there is need to change priorities because the resources are available, you know, to give us a sustainable future. It's all about priorities. If there is political will, then the change that people are demanding for is actually possible. So in 2018, that is when my journey of activism started. It was towards the end of the year when I started to carry out research about the challenges that the people in my country, Uganda, were facing. And at that point, I got to understand that climate change was one of those challenges and actually the greatest threat facing the lives of so many people at that time and even right now. In school, we all knew climate change being the changes in weather, weather conditions over a long period of time, but we didn't know about the reality, of the climate crisis. We didn't have, that experience of, feeling like this was something that was happening right now and affecting people's lives right now. So digging more into the subject and reading more about it, I got to learn about some of the impacts of the climate crisis. And some of these impacts were already evident in my country. For example, the floods, in the western part of the country, the landslides in the Mount Elgon area of, the country. These are things that were already evident. And at that point, I decided that I had to do something about it. I had to use my voice to demand for climate justice. And being inspired, by Greta Thunberg from Sweden to start the climate strikes, I also founded the climate strikes in my country, in Uganda. And it has been, a journey of striking every Friday, organizing and mobilizing in schools and carrying out, climate education and reaching out to as many, communities as possible to communicate the crisis, but not just the crisis, to also communicate the power of the people in driving change. And it has also been a journey of meeting so many different people, especially young activists, and learning from them and learning from their experiences and the work that they're doing in their countries.
I know that you have a business degree, but you've also been pretty critical about capitalism as it exists today, as a driving force in a lot of these problems that we're facing, unintended consequences or not. What do you think are the biggest systemic barriers to meaningful change?
Yeah, I think one of those things is the lack of awareness among different people. I can give an example, when I was in Glasgow for the climate strikes and also, for the COP26, there was some news in my country and there was some follow-up comments from different people saying that, we as activists, we were exaggerating the climate crisis. So I think also, the lack of awareness among the public is also a very huge problem in us achieving change, because if we do not have support, from the different people, especially in our communities, it makes even our work harder to demand for climate justice. And I believe that we need as many climate activists as possible from different parts of the world to rise up, because I know that there is so much power in the people, to drive change and bring about sustainable futures. And I think the other thing is about the priorities, like, Professor Harari talked about. It is the political will. If there is no political will, to give us real systemic change for a more climate friendly, world, then it may be hard for us to ever see, the changes, because as activists, we will organize in our communities, we will organize on the streets, we will protest, but then the decision lies in the leaders. You know, they're the ones who make this, the signings, they're the ones who decide on the policies. So there is a huge responsibility on the leaders to have, you know, a political will that will ensure that the future and the people are protected. And I also think the other thing comes really through media. Media also has a huge responsibility in highlighting and amplifying, you know, the different voices, the different people. Because the other thing we see is that for many people in the global north, as we all, you know, fight for 1.5 degrees Celsius, to many people in the global north, 1.5 is like the survival point. But then when you get to listen to someone, maybe, you know, from an African country, you get to realize that even at 1.2 degrees, the climate crisis is already affecting so many people. So I think there is a huge, you know, responsibility for media to really amplify the voices of activists, of communities from the most affected areas, because we are facing the climate crisis, and the leaders need to understand the urgency, not for them to feel like we are, you know, we are still okay as long as we keep it under 1.5, everything is okay. But even at 1.2, it isn't okay. And you can only get that, you know, from the stories of the people that are on the front lines of the crisis.
Absolutely. You remind us that this is the most unjust crisis. It's so unfair. It punishes the young for the sins of the old. It punishes the poor for the sins of the rich. It's the analogy I heard that I really stuck with me. It's as if the people in the Western world were smoking a carton of cigarettes a day and living long, happy lives, but people in, say, Bangladesh or Uganda were getting lung cancer at you know, uncommensurate rates. But Professor Harari, how do we change that story? The way that the system is set up now is you don't get elected to at least a political office or to a board of directors seat by saying, we need to slow down growth, we need to temper this, you know, rampant focus on GDP or quarterly statements. You've written, it really struck with me that humans have the free will to do what they desire, but they can't change what they desire. They can do it, but they can't change what it is they're after. And doesn't this crisis demand that we change what human beings desire? And can stories, do they have the power to change that so dramatically in the amount of time we have?
No, we don't need to change the fundamental things that we desire. We need to change the way that we go about achieving them. People desire, I don't know, peace of mind, to be peaceful inside yourself. This is something almost everybody wants. So, you know, you listen to the commercials on television and you get this idea that if I want peace of mind, I need to fly to the other side of the world, to some idyllic island, and spend lots of money and create enormous amounts of pollution in the process in order to get peace of mind. And this is just nonsense. I mean, you don't need to change your basic desire to have peace, but you can achieve it right here. You don't need to fly to the other side of the world. And similarly, people want to be loved and they want to love, but it doesn't really cost so much money. You don't need these, you know, entire industries that are supposed to make you more attractive or whatever in order to have love in your life. You can achieve it much more cheaply and in a much more healthy way for you and the environment. So the basic desires of human beings, yes, it's very difficult to change them, and we don't need to change them. We need to change the extremely roundabout and sometimes ridiculous way that we go about pursuing these fundamental human needs and human desires. And this is, again, it's really about the stories that we believe and that we tell ourselves. And yes, I mean, if you go to the level of politics, so for instance, to be elected for office, if guilt is not something that will get you elected. If you think about the rich and powerful countries which are really responsible for this crisis, as a politician, if you go around and basically telling people you're guilty for this, it's true, but it probably won't get you elected. powerful people, they don't like guilt. Maybe just a little bit of it, but not a lot. Yeah. So we have to be wise about the way that we frame this. And we need to find ways, again, you mentioned the kind of imperative for economic growth. There is no necessary contradiction between a greener and cleaner economy and growth. We can, to some extent, over the long run, achieve both. When we talk about investing in cleaner and better infrastructure, technology, and so forth, it's not like we take all this money and make a huge bonfire as a sacrifice to the spirits of the earth. No, you invest the money in new technologies, in better infrastructure, in ecological projects, like the Green Wall of the Sahel. And this not only helps the environment, over the long run, it also actually creates jobs and creates economic prosperity. So this kind of binary thinking that there is a necessary clash between the economy and the environment, and you have to choose, if we think like that, it's going to be very difficult. We need to find ways to, in a way, combine the two and have policies that, yes, in the immediate term, it will have economic difficulties. We have to be honest about it. But in the long run, it doesn't mean that we have to give up modern civilization or we have to give up modern technology. We can find ways to just do it better.
Vanessa, when it comes to your activism, it sounds to me like you think just getting the message out is hugely important, that there's not enough awareness. But what have you found to be the most effective? Is it using guilt against a leader these days? Although it seems that there more and more world leaders are impervious to guilt. They miss that gene somehow. But what carrots, what sticks, what motivators, what do you think is worth an activist's time, and what do you think is a waste of time?
Well, I think, one of the things that I've seen in my activism journey has been speaking truth to power. And I think that is something that can really help us a lot in achieving a more sustainable world. Because what is truth when we are speaking in activism? It is telling the real stories like it is. Because when I find myself in places whereby, an example I've already given, if I find myself in places where people are saying 1.5 is our survival, I will speak the truth of what is happening on the ground, that for us 1.5 is not actually the survival, because even below 1.5, people are already suffering some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. When I'm in a place and people are, for example, talking about electric vehicles, for sustainability, I will speak the truth that I see, that many communities where the materials needed for the manufacturing or the making of these vehicles, many women have to go through violence. Many children experience child labor in many, in the parts where the mineral needed to make an electric vehicle is made. So that when everyone is saying electric vehicles, it is our way to, sustainability. You speak the truth, beyond that, beyond the electric vehicle, who is being impacted by it and who is benefiting from it. If I'm in a place and, a corporation is talking about a tree planting campaign, you speak the truth of how corporations are, exploiting and grabbing lands of indigenous who can plant trees and make that tree planting campaigns, possible. So I think one of the things that is really important, in the movement is to keep speaking truth to power, because again, they will keep saying how the climate crisis is here, but then many people will not understand the urgency until you speak about, how climate change is exacerbating poverty, in different parts of the African continent. You keep speaking about how it's exacerbating gender inequality, or how it's making peace building efforts impossible, in some parts of the world, as people battle for the limited resources, as water, for example, as water sources dry up, they become limited. So communities battle for those limited resources. So I think it's really about speaking the truth to power when it comes to the urgency to talk about what is really happening on the ground and not what people think or imagine is happening, because climate change is more than weather. It's more than statistics. It's about the people. And when it comes to solutions, like I've said, people will always talk about climate solutions, but then you not and speak the truth about some of those solutions, who is benefiting from them and who is being harmed by what we all call climate solutions. Because in the end, everything that is being proposed as climate solution is actually not climate justice. If we are to have climate justice, that means the planet is okay and also the people are okay. I think that, to me, it's about keep speaking truth to power in, climate spaces and conversations.
Yeah, especially since we live in sort of the golden age of greenwashing. It is good for a brand to say the right things, or good for a politician in some places, but saying and doing are two different things, as we found out. Professor Harari, I'm wondering, as you study how the way humans organize themselves over time, of all the governments that have been tried up till now, what kinds do you think are the best and the worst equipped to deal with a problem like climate change? And who do you see like leading this mission? Is America's cold civil war, how much doom does that spell for the rest of the planet as just a massive consumer and producer? What are your thoughts on the geopolitical aspect of this story?
Well, the worst governments are those that focus on the protecting the interests of a single person, an autocratic dictator, or a very small clique around that person, and certainly don't care about humanity as a whole, but even don't really care about the nation. They may speak the language of patriotism and nationalism, but they actually are in the service of just one person or a very small group. Whereas the best governments are those that represent the broadest number of people and variety and diversity of viewpoints. They're usually also more concerned about the global situation because they realize that, as we just heard, everything is connected, and you advance one particular solution, you need to see how it impacts people in other places in their actual lives. So this is where I would draw the kind of line. Certainly, what's happening in the US is not helpful because it is still the biggest economic and political power on earth. And it used to be a global leader on many things, and it's now basically abdicated its global leadership role, and nobody's really stepping up to fill that vacuum. And we don't really need a single country to be the leader. Ideally, many countries, many organizations on the grassroots level should each be contributing their ideas, their motivation towards a common project. But in the end, it's a global problem that can only be solved through global cooperation. And to have this kind of cooperation, you need leadership. And it's very unfortunate that at the present moment, we don't have it. We don't have it even on a far more immediate crisis like COVID. We haven't really seen much global leadership on that. It's going to be even much more difficult with climate change.
I think that I keep coming back to the idea that the COVID pandemic is really a dress rehearsal on a much smaller level for the climate crisis, and a reminder about how communities that have trust and faith in science and each other sort of suffer the least, and those who wait for those citizens to start dying suffer the most. But at the same time, we're still so divided globally, within countries about these sorts of things. And there's a lot of hope that if governments can't pull it together, then maybe it'll be corporations like benevolent capitalism Professor, what are your hopes for that? You write a lot about technology. I look at, some of our brightest minds spending their days working on cryptocurrencies and NFTs and space tourism instead of like planet-saving innovations, not to judge anybody's career choice. But do you have hope that ultimately the new ideas, the new technologies will be more solutions than distractions?
Well, first of all, it should be clear that the role of leadership and making policy should be firmly in the hand of politicians, not in the hand of corporations or even in the hands of scientists. Private businesses and also scholars, they don't represent the public. They have their jobs, which are important, but ultimately it's politicians who are supposed to represent the interests of humans, and they should be the one who are leading. With regard to technology, technology is obviously the key. It created the problem in the first place. It's also a key to the solution. But by itself, technology is never a solution, because every technology can be used for good or for ill. It depends on how you do it, on which interests you take into account. So yes, we need people to work on the technological aspects, but we need the politicians to direct it in the right way for the benefit of the greatest number of people and of the entire ecosystem. And, one of the biggest dangers in the technological utopianism, that, the technology will solve it, is the kind of Noah Ark syndrome, like in the Bible with the flood, that yes, eventually they built an ark, but just for 5 people or something like that. Right. Almost everybody drowned. And there is a very big danger that with climate change, when people talk about what's our future going to be like, there is no us, there is no our future. Humanity might divide into a majority maybe of people who would suffer tremendously, and a minority that will have the resources, the wealth, the technology to protect themselves and even flourish in some kind of technological Noah's Ark. And this is extremely dangerous. Again, I think one of the reasons that we don't see enough urgency from leaders, from business elites and so forth, is that in the back of their mind, they are counting on a technological Noah's Ark. And that's very, very dangerous.
Vanessa, I know that you focused a lot on loss and damage, trying to get countries that had contributed very little to the problem some support from the richer countries that have sort of created the mess. What has that been like? What have been your successes and roadblocks to getting people to do the right thing on a global scale?
Well, yeah, we all understand that loss and damage is something that is already happening right now in so many vulnerable countries. And there was so much conversation and work being done to ensure that loss and damage is put on the agenda, especially at the COP26. But then we saw that, there's no separate fund that was put in place specifically for loss and damage. And yet so many communities are already suffering loss and damage. And this is something that I have said, multiple times, that loss and damage, as it affects so many communities, people end up losing things that they cannot adapt to. People cannot adapt to starvation. You saw the Eastern Africa drought that left over 26 million people with no access to food, with no access to water. So how can people adapt to starvation? How can people adapt to loss of lives because of some of these disasters? As loss and damage continues to happen, people's cultures are being lost, people's histories are being lost. So, and these again are things that people cannot adapt to. So it's really important that loss and damage is not only put on the agenda, but also a separate fund, to be put in place specifically for loss and damage, because in the end, without this fund for loss and damage, then there is no lifeline for so many people who are already losing things that they cannot adapt to. We know that adaptation and mitigation is important, but even the climate finance of $100 billion that was promised, it is yet to be delivered. It hasn't been delivered, and the countries on the front lines of the climate crisis are still waiting, for this climate finance to be delivered. So, to me, in this year, as COP27 is going to be in Egypt, it's really important that many people rise up together, and especially the governments in Africa, African leaders, to unite together to put a demand, as we go to COP27, to put a serious demand on climate finance for adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage, a separate fund for loss and damage, because we can't do it by ourselves. Many times as activists, we are asked for solutions. What can we do to make sure that the funding is got for loss and damage? But we can't do this alone. We need the support of leaders to come together, to unite together, and really place these demands as vulnerable, the people on the front lines, to put those demands on the global north, because we know who caused the climate crisis and we know who needs to pay. So it's important that the people who are responsible for climate change show us the money for adaptation, for mitigation, but also for loss and damage.
Professor, as you watch the COP process, it took 26 of these conference of parties for them to even utter the word coal as a driving force of a dirty energy. Given all the various special interests coming at this problem from all different corners of the world, how would you characterize the effectiveness of these global conversations as to getting us to the ultimate end?
Well, things are moving in the right direction, but far too slowly. As things look right now, looking to the future, it looks grim. That we are not doing enough. It doesn't seem that we will be doing enough on time. Again, I can't predict the future. What I can say when looking at the present is that we have the resources to solve it, but we are not doing the right things. And I hope, and the most tragic things in history are not the unavoidable disasters. The biggest tragedies are the disasters that could have been prevented. So we are living right now in the midst of one, the COVID crisis around the world, which, compared to previous pandemics in history, the Black Death was an unavoidable disaster. Humanity did not have the scientific knowledge and the technological power to understand and prevent or stop the Black Death. COVID-19, in contrast, we still have the scientific knowledge and the power to stop it, and we are not doing it. So it's a much bigger tragedy in this sense. And it's the same with climate change, that we can prevent it, but we are not doing it. And this is extremely unfortunate.
Yeah, I have a question here from one of the audience, Radoshi, following up on the COP 26-27 idea. For Vanessa, do you think keeping 1.5 alive is achievable given what's the progress that's happened at these latest COPs?
Well, I'll first say that we've had 26 COPs, and even with 26 COPs, the climate crisis has continued to escalate, and people have continued to be impacted by this crisis. But also following on what Professor Harari has said, we have the resources to actually stop the climate crisis. So meaning 1.5 is actually achievable if there is the will of governments, to make this happen, and not just, to commit to making it happen, but to actually make it happen. Because every COP, there are always commitments, there are always promises, there are always pledges, but then commitments will not stop the warming of the planet. Pledges will not stop the suffering of the people, and promises will not stop emissions from rising. What will stop, the climate crisis will be real action, starting right now. So it is achievable if there is political will to do so.
This is a question. Oh, please go
maybe
ahead.
I'll just add to that sometimes I hear people say that no, it's a very long-term project and it's kind of complicated with all these statistics. People can't unite behind this kind of long-term project. Certainly when you look at elections in democratic countries. And it's not true. People can unite around long-term projects, even based on all kinds of complicated statistics. To give one counterexample, if you look at the rise of populist and ultra-nationalist parties in different parts of the world, what they tell people often is a long-term story about demographics. They frighten people with all kinds of fantasies that you will be replaced in a couple of decades, you will be replaced by immigrants and foreigners and so forth. And even though this is probably not true, and even though it's a long-term prospect, it's not put tomorrow, it's in 40 years or 50 years, and even though it's based on complicated demographics, it's powerful enough to catapult all kinds of ultra-nationalists and populists to power. So, I don't like these kinds of politics, but there is one lesson we can learn from them, that you can mobilize people around a long-term, hazy project in order to make a drastic change in politics. So it's not impossible.
I'd like that harnessing that power for a more benevolent purpose to get people worried about the future in that way. It's interesting. Milena wrote in, she touched on your article, The Surprising Low Price Tag, Professor, and she's wondering, what can we as young students, future leaders do right now to encourage these sorts of investments to happen right now? And this is really a question, I think, for both of you. Just when people ask, what can I do? What do you tell them, Vanessa? What do you say, Professor, when people want a sense of agency, but the problem seems too big for any one person to bear?
Well, I think I'll give two pieces of advice. First of all, join an organization. And secondly, focus on a particular concrete issue. Single individuals working in isolation, it's very difficult to achieve anything. But even if just 50 people join together to an organization, they have enormous power. This is the superpower of humanity, organizations. So 50 people working together have a lot more power than 5,000 people, each working in isolation as an individual. And secondly, if you look at the big picture, then you feel if you're not the leader of a country, then you feel hopeless. What can I do about the planet? Don't worry about the entire planet. Find one thing which maybe is close to your heart and which you have the knowledge or the ability to actually affect, and focus on that. And if enough people do these two things, focusing on particular projects and joining organizations in order to make a difference, I think we can still prevent catastrophic climate change.
Vanessa, how has the pandemic affected your activism work and the inability to get big marches together in the streets the way you used to? And what do you tell young people, or people of any age really, who say, what can I do?
Well, of course, I get that question so many times, especially because we reach out to communities and also, to students in schools. And, recently, that is, I think this week, I was at a school with fellow activists and was speaking to different students of different grades. And there was I think there were around 7 to 9 years, and there was a group of around 7 to 9 years, and they were asking us what they can also do, for the environment. And I remember asking if they all had, water bottles, that they carry to school. And they all said, yeah, they do. And I told them that is something that they're already doing at a very young age, because of that water bottle, they don't have to use a plastic bottle, and they end up protecting, a marine species somewhere in the lake where many of those plastics, end up. So this is for, someone who is like 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, who wants to do something, because I know that as, a very young person or as a child, you don't need to know about, the complex issues of, the climate, but it is just those small things that a young person can start with, and as they grow in knowledge and wisdom about these issues, they start to expand more on what they want to do. And then, for the older people, like, Professor Harari has talked about, finding that one thing. It's important for people to know that we are like in a system, and that system, everything is interconnected. So if one part of the system, is not okay, or if one part of the system is damaged, then eventually, the whole system will crash down. So when you find that one piece in the system, that one thing in the system that you want to focus on, you're actually benefiting the whole system. So I think that is another thing that, people can do. Just find something that you feel, you can do, and something that you feel you can educate, yourself about through articles or through, short online courses to learn more about it. That you're not just doing that one thing, but you're actually benefiting the system. Like if it's a puzzle, you just get that one piece of the puzzle. When we all put those pieces together, we eventually realize that the puzzle is actually full. So you just find that one thing, that you can focus on. It can actually transform so many people's lives. And then for the pandemic, of course, when the pandemic started in my country, we may not do strikes like the rest of, the people do them maybe in Europe or in the United States. Many of our activism is in schools and going to schools. So during the pandemic, schools were closed, so we couldn't go to schools anymore. And also the challenge of, students not having phones. But what we were doing was, for those who could access phones, we were ensuring that, we share most of the work that we were doing on social media through blog writing, through videos, and also through sharing pictures of our climate strikes from our homes or our places for those, who continued to work even during the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also, as a professor mentioned too, it's sort of therapeutic. When you feel isolated and alone and powerless, getting out and working with like-minded folks on something tangible, it helps. There's, I believe it's Professor Chenoweth out of Harvard who did this paper on the 3.5% rule. She studied nonviolent protest movements through history, and if they can found that if you get 3.5% of a population behind something, they have twice as much chance of changing policies than violent protests. And in a country like the United States, that's only, in quotes, 9 million adults. So you don't need, everybody in the streets every day. But actually, Professor Tina writes a question: if it is a political duty for citizens to take action on climate change, what does this mean for citizens living under authoritarian regimes? A single party government like in China can decide to either build a solar field or a coal-fired power plant, and they don't have to mess with the politics that we have in the United States. But what about the people living in those countries who want to do something?
Well, it depends on in which country you live. In some countries, you can really do very little. You basically need to survive. But in other countries, even under authoritarian regimes, there are areas where you can still take action, whether it's in the private sector of business, whether in the development of technology, whether it is in environmental policies. So it's again, Each country is different in this respect, in how much agency it allows citizens to have. But usually, except in extreme cases, people still have agency. And it's very disheartening to tell them, no, you can't do anything. Actually, this is part of what sustains autocracies in the long run, that people get the feeling that they just have no agency at all. And it's not true. Except for very extreme cases, people always have some measure of agency, and learning what you can do and actually trying to do it over time, also in addition to helping, say, environmental causes, can also cause political change. Like in the 1980s, during the fall of the process of the fall of communism, authoritarian communism in Eastern Europe, many of the first organizations were environmental because this was something that was, kind of between the cracks of the system, that it could still be done. So there is a link there, and we should remember that in most cases, people have some measure of agency.
Yeah. Since I brought up China, I should also point out they managed to clean the air around Beijing in startling amount of speed, given what people thought they were capable of just in the last few years. And a lot of it had to do with early social media protest and the fact that the decision makers were choking on the same air. So I think as the evidence of this crisis becomes more evident for a lot of people, some will be able to isolate and wall themselves off, but like I always say, sooner or later, we're all going to be climate reporters or climate activists, like it or not. Vanessa, when you talk to government officials in Africa, how do they compare to the rest of the world, to the developed world, dealing with this issue? Are you seeing, I know that the Greenbelt Initiative seems to be promising. How goes things in your corner of the world?
Well, I haven't spoken to any government official from Africa or from my country. And many times, of course, we ask ourselves if, they're watching us or if they're seeing the work that we are doing, so we never really get any kind of specific response from them or hear anything from them. So we can't tell whether they're in support or, not in support of the work, that we are doing. Yeah, I think, but what I've really seen mainly with the young people in Africa, it's beyond the climate strikes. There is a lot of projects that are going on ground in different communities. And I've seen this like with so many young African, people working to, bring water to their communities through putting in place or fundraising for water harvesting, techniques. I've seen, young Africans do climate education and planting fruit trees in households. And even with myself, working on a project of installing solar panels and eco-friendly cook stoves in schools. So that is something that I can talk about when it comes to the different activists in Africa. It goes beyond, the climate strikes, but actually running projects in their communities, to transform their communities.
It's great to hear sort of tangible examples. Finally, we're winding down towards the end here. I want to give you both just a chance to share final thoughts for those economics students and others interested out there. Words of advice, words of encouragement, final thoughts. We'll start with you, Professor.
Well, I'll just say that, we created the system under which we are now living, and we created this problem. We can also fix it. The way that the world runs, and if you think in economics, the kind of laws of the economic system, they did not come down from heaven. They are not the laws of nature. Humans invented them. and humans can change them. That's our unique ability, and we can do it. We don't have a lot of time, but it's still possible to change our priorities, to rewrite the rules of the game, so that not just a tiny elite, but all the inhabitants of the planet will have a better future, or for starters, will have any kind of future.
Well, I think for me, it's, for people to really envision the kind of future that they want, and to just imagine it and just have, that vision, and then to remember that it's one system, and, as we tackle the different parts of the system, we actually, end up manifesting that vision that we carry in our minds and in our hearts. And also for people to know that another world is not only necessary for all of us, but it's actually possible.
Amen. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream, not a nightmare." He focused on the positives that we're capable of, and it goes a lot farther. I want to thank both of you so much for your time and thoughts this morning. Please keep up the good work in your respective endeavors. And I can't wait to see what both of you come up with next.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And thanks to all of you for joining us here at the Warwick Economics Summit. I'm Bill Weir of CNN. It's been a pleasure hosting this panel, and I look forward to further conversations down the road. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. It's been great.
All right. Thank you all.